Okay, so this video lesson is going to look at the AQA Literature Paper 2 Section B, which is the anthology section. I'm going to focus on love and relationships, and in particular a question that tackles the two poems, When We Two Parted and Farmer's Bride. So it may be worth looking at the two videos on each of those poems or revising the poems prior to starting this video. Okay, a summary of the assessment objectives. It's a 30-mark question. It's broken down into 12, 12 and 6. That's AO1, AO2 and AO3. A quick pointer on the context, 6-mark section part of the mark scheme. And you don't have to designate an entire paragraph to context. Rather, it will be incorporated throughout your answer. The examiners are not looking for you to explicitly refer to context throughout, rather than, so say for example you talk about natural imagery, that's a nod to context because love poetry often contains a lot of natural imagery. Okay, so how to structure your answer to this question? Well, there's not one definitive way to do this. I'm going to show you or to illustrate one way of answering this question. Your teachers may have equally valid alternatives. It's entirely up to you which way you prefer. There are, however, certain elements the examiners are looking for you to explore within your answer regardless of which approach you take, namely language, form and structure, plus the effect of any devices or techniques within these areas. And there's my buzz phrase, method and meaning. That's really just encapsulates what the examiner is looking for, method and meaning throughout, not just in the poetry section either, but on other literature questions as well. Okay, so what does the question look like? Okay, well the question I'm going to focus on is this one. Compare how poets present difficult relationships in When We Two Parted and one other poem from Love and Relationships. That's a standard question format. Okay, so I've printed I've put the poem on the screen there. It's small type, but you don't need to see it now. A couple of points on the question. Most important word is compare. You could compare in every paragraph. For example, don't just analyse one poem then the other. Compare the structure of each poem in the same paragraph, then move on to your next point paragraph. Now you can within each paragraph analyse one poem, then the other poem, and then offer a comparative paragraph to conclude that point. Okay, again, there's not one correct way. So long as you're ticking all the boxes the examiner is looking for you to tick, then that's the main thing. So the first thing you need to do is to read the question highlighting the key words. So in this case, difficult relationships is a central part of the question. Everything then you write about needs to reference difficult relationships. You then need to identify the second poem. So in this case, I'm going to use Farmer's Bride. There are other options as well. So once you've done this, you know that every point you make must address this in some way. Use the language of the question in each paragraph, or synonyms of difficult in this case. Now you can read through the poem and highlight or underline everything you notice that relates to the question. You've got 45 minutes for this question, and each year the examiner's report states that students who show evidence of planning routinely secure higher marks. So you must plan your answer. So the suggested advice is to spend 10 minutes planning your answer for this question. Then write your answer for 30 minutes before checking over what you've written for the final 5 minutes. Okay, onto the write your answer for 30 minutes bit. I've just made a few observations to my bullet points. A conceptualised response is best, but you could also use a S.M.I.L.E format. But you can incorporate the conceptualised response into the S.M.I.L.E format, and I'll show you how to do that. Use comparative connectives throughout, because the question is asking you to compare. And then analysing key individual words and techniques, that's the method and meaning. It's great to identify the techniques or the poetic devices that are used, but you must explore their meaning also. Okay, so how do I select the second poem? Well, the answer is a conceptualised approach. So the best advice from the examiners is to base your answer on an idea or attitude and then take a two-pronged approach to the question. So you should be looking to link two poems based on their meaning rather than both, say, being in sonnet form. So for example, with this question in mind, in both When We Two Parted and Farmer's Bride, the poets explore the issue of difficult relationships. However, one poem is dealing with the painful ending of an affair several years earlier, whereas the other deals with the ongoing problematic relationship between a husband and his wife. Okay, so I've identified the second poem based on the idea behind the poem, so that's called a conceptualized approach to it. Some tips, you then need to focus on a comparison of language, form, structure, and then the effect using relevant terminology throughout. If it helps, you can follow the S.M.I.L.E structure. Again, I'll show you, I'll break that S.M.I.L.E structure down for you in a minute. Use the language of the question throughout. Always link back to the question in each paragraph and for each point. And a topic sentence at the start of each paragraph will ensure that you remain focused on the actual question. Okay, so some little tips there. So as promised, the S.M.I.L.E format. There's quite a lot of information on the next two or three screens, so do pause and take notes as we go. So I'd start with a little introduction. Now I'll write a sample introduction for this specific question in a minute, so you don't need to focus any more on that. But it's one or two sentences that set out your the idea behind your answer whilst introducing the second poem. So structure and form. So certain techniques that you can use when exploring that. So is it a sonnet form? Is it a dramatic monologue? Is it full of blank verse? Is there a rhyme scheme? Are specific words being rhymed? Is there no rhyme scheme? And what might the implications of that be? Are there stanzas? What's the line length? Is there enjambment, or is it end stopped, and is it full of caesura? And there's identifying the techniques, but you must explore the impact or the effect these techniques have. What was the poet's intention behind using a particular technique? So that's structure and form. Meaning and mood. What's the poem about? Are there any hidden messages? What's the attitude or tone of the poem or speaker? Is it serious, angry, regretful, cynical, object, whatever? And you can link this. Can you link this to context or what the poem's about? Is it autobiographical? What mood, what mindset was the poet in before writing the poem? Imagery and language you can combine together. So that's your literary techniques, your similes, your metaphors, personification, focusing on specific word choices, any imperatives, command language, and so on. And then effect isn't a separate paragraph. Effect you must incorporate. That's the meaning part of method and meaning. You must incorporate that throughout. Okay, so here's a screen of poetic devices. Again, I'm not going to read them. You can pause or you can print it out. But these should all be quite familiar to you. And these will help you greatly in your unseen question as well, because you'll be able to identify the same techniques you've been analysing in your anthology poems in the unseen poem. Okay, so back to the question. Compare how the poets present difficult relationships in When We Two Parted and one other poem from Love and Relationships. Remember, I'm picking Farmer's Bride. So remember, this is just one suggested approach to take. Your teachers may have their own equally valid alternatives. But so with everything I've just covered in mind, your answer could follow this structure. Introduction, brief intro where you introduce the second poem explaining in one sentence why you've selected it, why it links to the printed poem. Paragraph 1 explores comparisons in form and structure between the two poems plus the effect. Paragraph 2, explore comparisons in meaning, mood, tone and context plus effect in the two poems. And paragraph 3, explore comparisons in the use of language and imagery and effect in the two poems. And a brief conclusion, then summing up your answer to the question in one or two sentences. Now, I will break this down for you in a lot more detail now. So here's a sample introduction, and in the black type I've identified the elements of the paragraph that the examiner's looking for you to incorporate into any answer. So both, there's a comparative connective straight away. Both When We Two Parted and Farmer's Bride explore difficult relationships from the male perspective. In When We Two Parted, Byron provides an autobiographical account of the pain and suffering he had to endure, not only when the affair ended in silence and tears, but also now years later, as the pain is still real. Whereas The Farmer's Bride is a dramatic monologue told from the viewpoint of the frustrated farmer who does not understand why his bride turned afraid as soon as they were married. There's a sample introduction. It's a bit longer than perhaps I would normally use, but it introduces the second poem, and it sets out straight away a couple of comparative points. So then moving on to the paragraph 1, which is based on the form and structure. When We Two Parted consists of 4 8-line stanzas and has an A-B rhyme scheme, possibly reflecting how he wishes they were still together. So there's your method and there's your meaning. Or how his feelings have not changed. There's an alternative interpretation, so multiple interpretations. To get the top band in any of your literature questions, you need to engage with what's called tentative analysis. So you're not offering a definitive interpretation, you're offering possible interpretations, so multiple or alternative interpretations. It's called tentative analysis. The regular rhythm of the poem emphasises certain syllables such as cold and kiss, highlighting the speaker's pain. There's your method and there's your meaning. By contrast, and there's your comparison with the other poem, The Farmer's Bride contains 6 irregular stanzas, which could reflect that something is not quite right, method and meaning. There is a strong, though unpredictable, rhyme scheme, which also could imply that the narrative is an unhappy, imbalanced one, possibly reflecting that the bride has no voice throughout the poem. The use of enjambment could suggest that her problems are ongoing. Now, I stopped there. You could develop that point further to explore the fact that the bride has no voice. So there's your, and then I've highlighted the key elements of the paragraph the examiner is looking for. So there's your introduction in your first paragraph. Your second paragraph could focus on meaning, mood, tone, and context if possible. So I've put down some observations here. Now you can then go and take these and construct your own paragraph yourselves. Byron was a leading romantic poet, notorious for his scandalous affairs. He was alleged to have had an affair with a married woman, Lady Frances Webster, who went on to have a further affair with the Duke of Wellington. The tone is quite bitter and angry, whereas the tone of Farmer's Bride is more frustration, desire, and fear. Mew, on the other hand, led a difficult life full of hardship and was believed to have been homosexual, which may explain the tone of frustration in the poem. A Victorian-era poet at a time when a woman's voice had no resonance in society and homosexuality was illegal. And you can see that how that's relevant to the persona of the woman in the poem. Okay, and your third and final point should focus on language and imagery and effect. So some observations on that you can incorporate then into your own paragraph. In When We Two Parted, Byron uses a semantic field of death, so pale, sever, sorrow, knell, grieve, which emphasises the death and loss of the relationships. There's your meaning. Negative imagery used here to reflect the angry mood of the poem. Sever, cold, touch, deceive. Farmer's Bride uses a variety of natural and animal imagery to portray the girl. The farmer understands nature, its functions. Likewise, he expects his wife to provide him with children. She's compared to a frightened hare, shy as a leveret, like a mouse, then locked up, like a caged animal. She has no voice, perhaps like women in Victorian society, and even in her own home she has no voice. She's locked up, with her freedom removed. Okay, so, by all means, write this answer out yourselves in your own words. Keep remembering the key elements of the paragraph that you need to incorporate from the examiner's perspective. So language, form, structure, and effects, so method and meaning throughout. Okay, so that's plenty there for this question. If your membership allows, do submit this answer to me and I'll give it a grade and some detailed feedback as to how you can improve further. Okay, I think that's a wrap, as we say. Right, I'll go now. Bye-bye.